13 million Americans held their breath as Clint Eastwood leaned forward and told a black congresswoman on live TV that women like her mistake volume for vision. He thought the room would nod in agreement. Instead, it froze. And what happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was something far more dangerous to the old guard. It was clear. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She just looked him in the eye and said the one sentence that would ricochet across dinner tables, classrooms, courtrooms, and hearts. Maybe I'm not too much. Maybe you've been too little for too long. This wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. And while the details of this story are dramatized, names, moments, settings, the emotions, the truths, the tension, they're pulled straight from real rooms across America. What you're about to witness is fiction only by form, because what it means has been lived by millions. Now let's go back to where it started. Not with a headline, but with an invitation and a chair Jasmine Crockett didn't ask permission to sit in. It started with a message that wasn't on any schedule, didn't come from any assistant, and carried no subject line. Just one sentence. No greeting, no sign-off, only this. Panel taping moved to 7:40 a.m. Location change, Studio C. That was it. Jasmine Crockett read it twice before even blinking. Not because it was cryptic, but because it was too ordinary. And she'd learned long ago that danger never came with red flags. It came dressed as routine. She turned the phone screen toward her chief of staff, Marcus, who had been mid-sip of a lukewarm coffee. He frowned. I thought they were filming in Studio A. She nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. That's what the call sheet said last night. Neither of them said what they were thinking, but the silence between them pulsed with history. Moved locations, moved time, no explanation, no contact. By 7:22 a.m., Jasmine was in the hallway of the network building in downtown Dallas, heels clicking across a floor too polished for comfort. The studio lights were already glowing behind the frosted glass, and a junior producer, barely old enough to rent a car, flashed her a clipboard smile. You're good to go. Straight ahead. No small talk, no rundown, just a hand gesture like a traffic cop moving cars along. Jasmine gave a tight nod and walked in, her presence steady and unhurried, like she wasn't walking into a setup but a courtroom. And maybe that's how she saw it. Every room was a courtroom. Some just didn't admit it. The chair across from her was empty. But the nameplate on the table said it all. Clint Eastwood. That name wasn't in the rundown either. Not in the briefing, not in the network email, not even in the whispered conversations on the ride from the hotel. And that was no accident. It never is. She sat down slowly, navy blue blazer, crisp, gold vote pin catching the studio lights just enough to make it gleam. Her fingers rested lightly on her lap. Her posture wasn't stiff. It was anchored, like she belonged there, even if someone in the room hoped she'd doubt it. Somewhere behind the cameras, the host's voice was rehearsing lines off a teleprompter. One generation built it, another wants to change it. Who gets the final say? Background music swelled, a rising blend of patriotism and morning talk show perk. But Jasmine barely heard it. Her eyes were fixed on the glass door across the room. Waiting. And then it opened. He entered like a man walking into a western. Clint Eastwood didn't need applause. He didn't even need to speak. Just the sight of him, shoulders back, expression unreadable, jacket creased like it had been in 100 battles, shifted the air. There were no greetings, no handshakes, just a nod between two worlds that had never truly understood each other. And in that moment, Jasmine understood something too. She hadn't been invited to speak her mind. She'd been baited, scheduled, moved, positioned. This wasn't a panel. It was a pressure test. She was the unknown variable. The network wanted a clip, a clash, a moment. But they had underestimated something crucial. Jasmine Crockett didn't come here to perform. She came ready to hold the mirror. And no one, not even Clint, knew what that reflection might reveal. The cameras were still adjusting when Clint Eastwood took his seat. No eye contact, no small nod of respect. He simply lowered himself into the leather chair across from Jasmine with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades being told he belonged wherever he sat. His blazer, charcoal gray with visible wear at the elbows, looked like it had seen more war rooms than green rooms. He didn't smile. He never did. And that, they said, was part of his mystique. The American icon who didn't need pleasantries, because his silence carried more weight than most people's speeches. Jasmine glanced at him briefly, not with challenge, but with calculation. She had read every room she'd ever entered since she was 12 years old. Because when you're young, Black, and a woman, you learn quickly, it's not just about what you say, it's about what they've already decided before you open your mouth. In this room, it wasn't built for her, not the show, not the format, not the lighting. She was the anomaly by design. The question was whether they expected her to be grateful for the seat or apologetic for what she might say once she sat in it. The host, Daniel Everett, walked in with the smooth awkwardness of a man who had memorized every question and none of the history. His suit was tailored, his grin polite, and his voice just the right amount of bland to be considered neutral. He took his place between the two guests like a referee hoping he wouldn't have to blow a whistle. "We're live in 30, the stage manager called out, her voice sharp and practiced. And just like that, the countdown began. 29. Jasmine exhaled quietly. 20. Clint adjusted his cufflinks. 10. The theme music started, complete with American flags fluttering behind stock images of Main Street. 5. Daniel looked directly into the camera. 3. Jasmine sat a little straighter. 2. Clint leaned slightly back. 1. And welcome back to American Square, where conversations happen across generations, values, and visions for this country, Daniel announced. Today we're joined by actor and American icon Clint Eastwood and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising voice in progressive policy. The camera panned wide, capturing the stark contrast, the silver-haired legend in faded gray, and the sharp-eyed lawmaker in navy blue with a pin that gleamed like a challenge. Daniel turned to Jasmine first. "Congresswoman, you've been vocal lately about redirecting federal funds toward education and housing. Some say that's a bold departure from where the country's been headed." Without hesitation, she replied, "It's only bold if you've never struggled. But if you're a teacher working 2 jobs or a veteran sleeping in their car, it just sounds like common sense." A quiet hum from the live audience followed. Not applause, but a pulse, a subtle signal of attention. Clint remained motionless, arms crossed loosely, eyes half closed in that deliberate way he'd mastered decades ago. Then Daniel pivoted to him. "Clint, you've spoken often about discipline and tradition. Do you think we're coddling the next generation?" Clint leaned forward ever so slightly, voice slow and dry like sandpaper. "I think we're confusing kindness with leadership. This country was built on hard decisions, not handouts." The air tightened. No one interrupted. And without raising her voice, Jasmine turned her head and said, "Or maybe we finally remembered what compassion looks like." The silence that followed Jasmine's words wasn't empty. It was electric. It stretched across the studio like wire pulled taut, invisible yet undeniable. Clint didn't speak, not right away. His fingers tapped once on the table, slow and deliberate. The kind of gesture that said he'd heard her, but wasn't sure yet how to respond. Daniel, caught between their gaze, shifted in his chair like a man realizing too late he wasn't moderating a panel. He was watching a collision, and it had only just begun. Jasmine didn't flinch. That was the part the camera wouldn't capture clearly. Her stillness wasn't passive, it was chosen, practiced. The kind you develop after years of being interrupted mid-sentence, or talked over in rooms where your ideas only made the agenda after someone else repeated them in a deeper voice. She sat with her hands folded, shoulders even, eyes steady, not looking for validation, but watching the temperature of the room change one heartbeat at a time. Clint finally spoke, but it wasn't a response. Not directly. Instead, he looked to Daniel. "You want to know how we fix the divide?" His voice was calm but cooler now. "We don't bridge it by tearing down everything that came before us. We listen. We learn from those who've been there. Too many of these new faces in politics act like anything before 1990 was a mistake. Change without backbone, he added, pausing just enough to glance Jasmine's way, is just noise. The audience murmured, some in approval, others not quite sure if they just witnessed a jab or a philosophy. Jasmine let the comment hang in the air. For 1 second, then two. Then, when the room had almost begun to breathe again, she answered, not with fire, but with steel. Backbone without compassion, she said, eyes locked on Clint. That's just cruelty. She didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. But the temperature dropped, and then rose, and dropped again. That sentence didn't just counter his, it reframed the entire conversation. You could feel it in the control room, where producers leaned closer to their monitors. You could feel it in the shifting postures of the live audience. Something had cracked, and no one wanted to look away. Daniel tried to smile. It didn't land. Well, he said, his voice thinner now, that's certainly one way to look at it. But Jasmine wasn't done. You talk about learning from the past, she continued, her tone calm, her pace deliberate. But real learning means studying where the past failed people, not where it made us comfortable. Nostalgia doesn't absolve damage, it hides it. Her words weren't designed to provoke. They were designed to land. Clint's brow furrowed for the first time. Not in anger, but recognition. He'd walked into this taping expecting disagreement. What he hadn't expected was to feel outflanked not by volume, but by precision. Jasmine didn't come to play a role. She came to challenge the script. And for the first time in a long time, Clint Eastwood wasn't sure what scene he was in anymore. It should have been an easy pivot. Daniel, sensing the air in the room had turned volatile, reached for the next card on his stack with the nervous hands of a man trying to put the fire out without admitting there was smoke. Let's talk about leadership, he offered, his smile a little too forced now. Clint, earlier in the green room, you mentioned that leadership doesn't look the way it used to. Could you expand on that? Clint shifted in his chair and gave the briefest of glances toward Jasmine, like a poker player checking his opponent's stack before going all in. He didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone sharpened, subtle, but unmistakable. I said, Clint began slowly, that too many people in leadership today are more concerned with feelings than with facts. They talk tough, but fold the moment someone accuses them of being unfair. He paused just long enough to let his next words land exactly where he wanted them. You're smart, no doubt, he said, nodding faintly toward Jasmine. And you've got presence. But leadership, real leadership, it doesn't come from hashtags or protest signs. It comes from sacrifice, from knowing when to shut up and get the job done. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He just leaned back, satisfied, as if he'd just restored order to a room that had forgotten its place. The silence that followed wasn't admiration. It wasn't agreement. It was the kind of silence that precedes the moment a dam cracks. Jasmine blinked once. That was all. No expression. No visible reaction. Just the tap of one finger, barely audible, against the wooden edge of her chair. Clint had mistaken her quiet for concession, but Jasmine wasn't digesting the insult. She was dissecting it. In her mind, the sentence wasn't about leadership. It was about power, and the need to remind her, publicly, of who was allowed to define it. In the control room, a voice whispered, "Don't cut to break. Let it breathe." Everyone watching knew something had just shifted, not on the surface, but underneath, where impact lives. And it wasn't just Jasmine who felt it. It was every woman who had ever been told to stop being so emotional. Every Black professional who had ever been praised for being articulate right before being undermined. Every leader who had been told their strength needed to look like someone else's shadow. Jasmine turned her head, not to the camera, not to the host, but to Clint directly. And for the first time since the segment began, she spoke without any buffer between her truth and his tradition. You think I don't understand sacrifice? She asked, voice low, not shaking. You think leadership is silence wrapped in a suit? Then maybe that's why people keep mistaking cruelty for discipline. She didn't wait for his answer. She didn't need it, because this wasn't a debate. It was a diagnosis. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in Congress, before she held a microphone or drafted legislation or sat across from living legends on national television, She was a 12-year-old girl in a public school classroom just outside Fort Worth. Her hand was always the first to shoot up, her voice clear, her answers sharper than most of the boys who sat in the front row. But no one remembers that part. What stuck with her, what etched itself into the folds of her memory, was the way her sixth-grade teacher would pause, look her in the eye after she answered, and say, "You're very bright, Jasmine, but you should smile more when you speak. It softens the edge." At the time, Jasmine didn't know what the edge meant, but she learned quickly. The edge was a phrase people used when a black girl spoke with too much clarity, too much certainty. It wasn't the content of her voice that troubled them, it was the conviction behind it. So she tried. For a while. She practiced saying, "I think," before every idea. She lowered her tone in debate club. She folded her hands and waited for the boys to finish, even when she had the answer first. And each time she did, she felt herself shrink. Just a little. But shrinking, she realized, didn't make her more likable. It just made her invisible. Her mother noticed first. One night, while packing dinner leftovers for the next day's lunch, she looked at Jasmine and asked, "Why are you speaking like you're apologizing for something?" Jasmine hadn't even realized she was. Her mother, a night shift nurse who worked 12-hour shifts without ever once calling in sick, stood there, tired, aching, and unshakable. "You're not here to make people comfortable," she told her. "You're here to be heard. If your voice makes someone uncomfortable, it means they weren't listening close enough before." That conversation stayed with Jasmine long after she outgrew that classroom. It followed her into college lectures where professors called her passionate in a tone that meant too much. It echoed in interviews where board members asked if she could be less assertive in media appearances. And it roared silently during her first committee hearing when an older congressman leaned over and whispered, "You've got potential if you can learn to ease off the gas." Now, sitting across from Clint Eastwood in a room engineered for moments just like this, Jasmine heard every echo all over again. The message hadn't changed. It had just gotten older, deeper voiced, and better dressed, but its meaning was still the same. Know your place. Lower your tone. Smile more. She didn't smile. She never would. Not just to be palatable. Not anymore. Because when they said too sharp, what they meant was too sure. When they said too emotional, they meant too unwilling to play small. And when Clint spoke of sacrifice, Jasmine didn't just hear the weight of his past, she remembered the cost of her silence. The studio hadn't planned for a viral moment. They'd wanted tension, maybe a sharp exchange, something they could trim down to a 15-second teaser and splash on social media with the caption, "Different generations. Same America." But what they got instead was a sentence, just one, delivered without a raised voice, without a dramatic pause, without even a glance at the camera. It came right after Clint leaned back with the smirk of someone who believed he'd just made his final point and the world ought to catch up. Jasmine turned, slow and sure, and said, "Maybe I'm not too much. Maybe you've been too little for too long." It didn't sound like a comeback. It didn't have the rhythm of a clapback. It wasn't laced with cleverness or wrapped in applause bait. But the moment she said it, the air shifted. Not the way a door slams, but the way a foundation settles. You could see it in the way Clint's jaw tensed, in the way Daniel stopped flipping cue cards, in the way the producer behind the glass whispered, "Don't cut. Let it breathe." And breathe it did. For 6 long seconds, no one moved. No one filled the silence. Because that sentence didn't need backup. It brought its own. Viewers at home felt it too. In living rooms across the country, people leaned forward on sofas, cereal spoons paused midair, phones tilted up instinctively to start recording. Some rewound it in real time. Others didn't dare look away. And somewhere in Fresno, a teenager clipped the moment on her phone and tweeted, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard." The clip hit 10,000 retweets in the first 15 minutes. By the end of the hour, it was circulating across group chats, news feeds, political pages, and yes, even veteran forums. Not everyone agreed with her, but almost no one ignored her. Back in the studio, Jasmine didn't follow the sentence with a speech. She didn't hammer it home. She let it hang, fully aware that its echo would do more damage than repetition ever could. Clint remained silent, not because he didn't have a response, but because the calculus had changed. The usual tools, dismissal, condescension, nostalgia, they weren't working. The crowd hadn't gasped. They hadn't applauded either. They'd done something more dangerous. They'd gotten quiet. Daniel cleared his throat, visibly trying to pull the show back to its safe center. Let's pivot to polling data, he offered, voice cracking slightly. But even as he spoke, the control room was already flagging the moment, time-stamping it, sending it to the network's digital team. It wasn't just television anymore. It was content, and they knew it. Still, Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile, because this wasn't about winning. This was about being heard, about saying the one thing that millions of people had carried in their chests but never dared to say aloud. Not in boardrooms, not in classrooms, and certainly not in front of men who built their authority on being unchallenged. That was the moment she stopped reacting to the conversation and started rewriting it. And as the cameras kept rolling, America wasn't just watching a debate. They were watching a threshold being crossed. And no one, not even Jasmine, knew yet just how far that sentence would travel. The clip hit 300,000 views before Jasmine had even taken off her microphone. It started on a teenager's Twitter account, someone in Fresno with a follower count just shy of 200, who had filmed her TV screen with shaky hands and captioned it with 10 words. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She just ended him. From there, the ripple turned into a wave. Political accounts grabbed it. Activist circles reposted it. TikTok creators added music underneath it, turning her pause. 6 full seconds of silence after that one devastating line, into a beat drop that people couldn't stop watching. One account overlaid a slow zoom onto her face with the words, "Maybe I'm not too much," flashing like a lyric, and within hours it had crossed 1 million views. But this wasn't just a viral moment. It was a viral reckoning. People weren't just watching, they were seeing. Granddaughters showed it to their grandmothers. Sons forwarded it to their fathers. Teachers played it for their debate teams, asking, "Why do you think silence worked here more than shouting?" YouTube reaction channels posted breakdowns before the studio could even upload the official segment. One commentator paused the clip frame by frame, pointing out the flicker in Clint's eyes, the way Daniel froze, the deliberate stillness in Jasmine's breathing as she delivered the line. Not as a punch, but as a verdict. By mid-afternoon, hashtags were trending across platforms. Number not too much, number leadership redefined, number she didn't blink. A subreddit titled "The Quietest Clapback" gathered hundreds of comments dissecting the historical echoes in her words. This wasn't just a TV moment, one user posted. This was generational. Another wrote, "It felt like the whole country was holding its breath and finally exhaled." Even news outlets couldn't stay out of it. Digital front pages replaced morning headlines with screen grabs of Jasmine, still mid-sentence, eyes steady, mouth barely open. The caption underneath almost always the same. She said what needed saying. What caught fire wasn't just the sentence, it was the restraint, the refusal to lean on volume or theatrics, the understanding that what makes a moment unforgettable isn't how loud it is, but how deeply it resonates. Clint Eastwood had built a career on being the unshakable one in the room. And yet, in 26 seconds, Jasmine Crockett became the eye of a cultural storm without so much as lifting her voice. The algorithm didn't stand a chance. It did what it always does. It fed the fire. Pushed the clip to timelines of people who didn't watch political shows, who didn't know who Jasmine Crockett was, who hadn't heard Clint Eastwood speak since the early 2000s. But now they knew. And they were choosing sides, not between left or right, but between past and future. And the question wasn't whether Jasmine had won. It was, why did it take this long for someone to say it out loud? By sundown, Jasmine Crockett's name was in headlines from the Washington Post to BuzzFeed, from MSNBC to late-night roundtables that rarely gave airtime to rising politicians. Some called it a masterclass in restraint. Others labeled it a cultural reset, but not everyone cheered. In fact, the praise arrived just as swiftly as the pushback. Conservative pundits rushed to reframe the clip before it hardened into consensus. It was a setup, one cable host declared, designed for virality. That wasn't leadership. It was performance art. Another said Jasmine had only succeeded because she played into the victim narrative modern politics loves so much. On talk radio, callers demanded apologies, some for Clint, others for what this country is becoming. But Jasmine, she said nothing. No tweet, no follow-up interview, no press statement. Her account stayed silent while everyone else screamed. And in a news cycle that rewards speed, her stillness was almost disorienting. For those who supported her, the silence was a power move. For her critics, it was maddening. They needed her to respond, to misspeak, to gloat, to stumble. But she didn't give them that, because Jasmine Crockett didn't need to reclaim a moment she already owned. She knew the difference between a reaction and a reckoning, and she chose the latter. Her silence wasn't absence. It was presence, precise and unyielding. The more she said nothing, the more others filled the space with their interpretations. Think pieces exploded across platforms. One political strategist tweeted, "Crockett's silence is the loudest strategy I've seen in a decade." Another wrote, "What she's doing is not retreat, it's control." And it was true. Because by staying quiet, Jasmine allowed the country to argue not about her, but about itself. Students debated whether the moment was calculated or authentic. Veterans posted videos explaining why, even as longtime Eastwood fans, they found themselves nodding to her words. One woman recorded herself watching the clip with tears in her eyes saying, "I've spent 30 years in corporate America waiting for someone to say that out loud." The fire wasn't just in the comment section, it was in the quiet spaces, in kitchens, in break rooms, in the space between generations, where people suddenly found themselves having conversations they'd postponed for too long. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood gave one interview the next morning. Sitting in front of a window at his Monterey ranch, he shrugged when asked about the backlash. "I said what I believed," he replied. "If people don't like it, they don't have to listen." But people had listened, closely, not just to what he said, but to how Jasmine didn't need to interrupt him to dismantle him. Her response wasn't in her voice. It was in the mirror she held up, and in the silence that followed. And in that silence, something shifted. Not just in politics, but in people. It was a grainy phone video, filmed in a dimly lit living room, the kind with floral couches and a family calendar still flipped to the wrong month. In the frame, a black mother and her 12-year-old daughter sitting cross-legged on a carpet, staring at a paused TV screen. The daughter, wearing a wrinkled hoodie and holding a pencil she hadn't used for homework, looked up at her mom and whispered, "She talks like me." That was it. No fancy editing, no flashy captions, just one quiet sentence, spoken by a girl who had never seen her voice reflected back at her on television before. The clip was uploaded to TikTok by the mother's older son, and within hours it was everywhere. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. The moment struck a different chord. It wasn't political, it was personal. In hundreds of homes across America, parents played the clip for their children, not to explain politics, but to point and say, that's why you don't shrink." Teachers added the segment to their classroom slides, not to analyze the policy, it didn't need it, but to ask, what do you see in her that you've never seen before? In churches and community centers, Jasmine's voice was replayed over projectors, and it wasn't her credentials that moved people. It was her stillness, her refusal to perform, her ability to say, without apology, "This space was never meant for me, but I'm here anyway." One woman posted a video from her hospital bed, still in her gown, recovering from a procedure. "I've been told my whole life to lower my voice," she said, eyes glistening. Watching her sit in that chair and not flinch, that was medicine. Another, a Latina mother of 4 from Albuquerque, wrote, "I didn't know how much I needed that moment until I saw my daughter sit up straighter watching it." These weren't political responses. They were generational shifts disguised as comments and likes. Jasmine had stepped into a studio to do an interview, but what she had done without planning to was hold up a mirror, and people weren't just watching, they were recognizing themselves. And it wasn't just daughters. Grandfathers who had fought in wars and never cried in public suddenly found themselves blinking back tears, not because they agreed with everything she said, but because for the first time, They questioned why it had taken so long for someone like her to be allowed to say it without being cut off. One Vietnam vet wrote in a Facebook comment, "I didn't serve so people could be silenced. That girl's got more guts than half the Senate." The comment got thousands of likes, not for patriotism, but for honesty. What Jasmine had done wasn't about calling Clint Eastwood out. It was about calling something up, something buried in a generation that had been told too often to wait their turn, to hold their tongue, to take pride in their restraint, even when it cost them visibility. Jasmine didn't demand that people cheer for her. She didn't need to. All she did was take her seat without shrinking. And in doing so, she gave millions permission to finally take theirs. By the time the clip had reached 1 million views, Clint Eastwood had already returned to his ranch in Monterey. Sitting across from a reporter from a legacy magazine, he exhaled slowly and said, "I'm not sorry for what I said. I grew up in a world where we didn't complain, we endured. Where you earned your seat by bleeding for it, not tweeting about it." The journalist nodded, scribbling notes furiously. But Clint didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. For decades, he had been the face of the stoic American masculinity, gritty, unflinching, and unbothered. The studio had invited him for that very reason, to be the immovable object to Jasmine's rising tide. But what no one had expected was that the tide wouldn't crash. It would recede, revealing just how many of the old rules had started to rust. Back in the edit room, a junior producer whispered, "He thinks he's still fighting the Cold War." The line stuck, because Clint's language wasn't just outdated, it was shaped by a mythology that rewarded survival over reflection. Jasmine hadn't dismissed his generation's struggles, but she had exposed something he wasn't ready to face. That pain, when worn like armor, can become delusion. That sometimes the hardest thing isn't fighting the enemy, it's letting go of the version of yourself the fight created. When Clint said, "We bled for this country," Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let him speak. Let him remember. Let him cling to the weight of sacrifice as if it were a shield against accountability. And then calmly she replied, "I don't doubt you bled. But bleeding isn't the same as building something everyone can live in." The studio went quiet, not because it was shocked, but because it was true. There is a certain warmth to old delusions. They comfort those who believe that past suffering is proof of righteousness, that surviving injustice earns the right to define justice forever. But Jasmine wasn't attacking the past. She was unpacking it. And in doing so, she made clear, reverence doesn't mean silence, and honoring your father's war doesn't mean ignoring the wounds it left on your mother. For many in the audience, watching from small towns and big cities, this moment hit harder than policy ever could. It wasn't about which side was right. It was about finally hearing someone say what had simmered in unspoken spaces for too long. That strength isn't just about withstanding suffering, but refusing to pass it down as a legacy. And maybe that's what scared Clint the most. Not Jasmine's words, but her calm, her refusal to meet force with force, her ability to sit in her chair without folding under the weight of history, and still challenge it with a voice that didn't flinch. She didn't dismiss his war. She just reminded him that not all battles end when the bullets stop. Some continue, quietly, invisibly, in every room where people are still told their presence is too much. Strength had always been defined for Jasmine by what it wasn't. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it wasn't brittle or fragile or reactive. At least that's what she was told. But growing up, she noticed the hypocrisy, how people called her mother strong only when she was silent, only when she held back the tears after a 12-hour hospital shift, only when she let doctors call her girl without flinching. Her mother never fought back, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't think she could afford to. And Jasmine, sitting on the edge of the kitchen table, watching her mother remove her shoes in quiet pain, made a promise to herself. One day she would redefine what strength looked like, starting with not mistaking silence for dignity. That promise echoed inside her as she sat on stage, facing Clint's tired rhetoric. He believed strength came from surviving harshness, from enduring it without complaint. But Jasmine saw something different. She saw the danger of teaching young people that suffering was a rite of passage. She saw how strength, in its truest form, wasn't about how much you could take. It was about what you refused to normalize for the next generation. I'm not here because I endured, she said during a quieter moment in the segment. I'm here because I refuse to treat hardship like it was a badge of honor. My mother survived it, so I wouldn't have to. I don't plan to pass it down. There was no applause, no cue for dramatics, just that same unblinking steadiness that made people lean in rather than turn away. Somewhere in the audience, a producer scribbled on her notepad, "That's the sound of a new kind of power." Because what Jasmine brought to the table wasn't the defiance of protest, it was the conviction of memory. She wasn't just arguing policy. She was excavating what generations had buried under pride. And in doing so, she wasn't just challenging Clint. She was challenging an entire cultural template built on the illusion that quiet suffering equals moral superiority. Later that week, a clip of her saying, "Real strength is refusing to normalize the pain," was stitched into a TikTok video by a young black girl reciting the words in front of her mirror before school. That video went viral too, not because Jasmine had demanded it, but because the truth in her words found its own path to people who needed to hear it. Clint may have walked into that studio thinking he represented the last great version of American toughness, but Jasmine had quietly rewritten the script, without shouting, without name-calling, and without waiting for permission. She didn't just take up space. She expanded the definition of what taking up space could mean, because in her world, strength wasn't inherited, it was chosen, and it looked like showing up, speaking out, and refusing, no matter how heavy the moment, to sit small in someone else's story. Jasmine had spent most of her early career being told to wait her turn, not directly, not with those words, but it was there, in the sideways glances during committee meetings, in the backhanded compliments about her energy, in the way her questions got answered after the men in the room repeated them with more bass in their voices. The message was always the same. Wait. Wait until you've been around longer. Wait until you've paid more dues. Wait until the timing is better, quieter, safer, and she had waited until she realized the line they told her to stand in wasn't moving. It wasn't even real. So when Clint Eastwood leaned forward that day and spoke about sacrifice and discipline, when he suggested, without saying it, that people like Jasmine hadn't earned their right to speak with such certainty, she didn't bristle. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped out of line, not with aggression, but with clarity. Because waiting your turn only makes sense when the system is designed to eventually hand you the mic. But what if it never was? You say you respect service, she said, eyes locked on his. But what exactly do we mean by that? Because I see a lot of people clinging to old ways and calling it bravery. I see people who want the credit of building something, but none of the accountability for the damage it caused. She wasn't trying to win a soundbite. She was telling the truth as she had lived it, and that made it impossible to ignore. The studio stayed quiet, not out of shock this time, but recognition. You could feel it, in the shift of posture from the crew behind the cameras. In the way Daniel didn't reach for his next question right away. They weren't just hearing her, they were understanding her, and it unsettled them, because a voice like Jasmine's had never waited for permission, and now that it was speaking, it wasn't going back to silence. Later, a clip of that exact moment was posted with the caption, "She didn't interrupt." She outlasted the lie. It wasn't just being shared, it was being saved, downloaded, screen recorded, quoted in Sunday sermons and HR presentations. Because what Jasmine had said wasn't just about politics, it was about every room where someone had been told to wait, every board meeting where a woman was told her passion was too much, every classroom where a student of color had been encouraged to tone it down, every hallway where silence had been mistaken for professionalism. Jasmine's presence in that studio wasn't accidental, but the impact of her words, that was seismic. Not because she yelled, not because she demanded to be heard, but because she spoke like someone who had waited long enough and knew the cost of waiting too well to do it again. She wasn't there to argue for space, she was there to embody it. And in that moment, the most radical thing she did was speak as if she already belonged. It came casually, like a throwaway line meant to be clever but not held to consequence. Daniel, trying to pull the conversation back into neutral territory, asked Clint about the evolution of leadership in modern politics. Clint, half shrugging, gave the kind of response he'd given 100 times before. Politics used to be about doing the work, he said. Now it's theater. People play to cameras, not to convictions. He paused, glanced at Jasmine, and added with a smirk, especially when it's coming from women trying to play a man's game. The air in the room snapped tight, like a wire pulled to breaking. Even Daniel, ever the diplomatic buffer, froze. There was no laughter, no polite chuckles, only a dead silence that made every eye in the studio gravitate toward Jasmine. Not because they expected a response, but because they were bracing for what kind of storm might follow. But Jasmine didn't storm. She didn't even blink. Instead, she sat up straighter, adjusted her mic, and in that one breath, took back every inch of space the comment had tried to erase. "You think this is theater?" she said quietly. "Then let's make sure the lights are bright enough to show the cracks in the set." Her tone didn't rise. Her voice didn't tremble. But the weight in it dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward that no one could ignore. Clint leaned back, unmoved, or pretending to be. Jasmine leaned in, just enough to close the distance, not physically, but philosophically. "You call it performance because you're watching a kind of leadership you weren't trained to recognize," she said. "Leadership that doesn't come wrapped in sound bites or war stories. Leadership that's shaped by listening, not posturing. That's why it scares you, because it doesn't need to announce itself. It just is." The crew behind the scenes, still stunned, watched the monitor without blinking. A few camera operators had lowered their hands slightly, not because they were unprofessional, but because even behind the lens, they could feel the room holding its breath. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once during the entire segment, yet somehow every word she said carried farther than any performance ever could. What Clint called theater, Jasmine revealed as truth. Not the truth dressed for applause, the kind that strips down the set, exposes the scaffolding, and asks why we ever mistook staging for sincerity in the first place. She wasn't performing for a camera. She was confronting it, and for once it blinked before she did. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever raised her voice in a hearing, or chose not to, she had already learned how many expectations came baked into simply existing in a room she wasn't supposed to be in. Speak confidently, but don't sound aggressive. Defend your ideas, but don't interrupt. Be passionate, but never let it come across as emotional. And if you're a black woman, add 5 more layers. Smile, but not too wide. Be firm, but not intimidating. Disagree, but make them feel good about it. It was a constant calculation, an exhausting dance where the rules changed depending on who was watching and who felt threatened. She didn't grow up imagining herself in politics. She grew up watching her mother hold entire households together on double shifts while being told to just be grateful when doctors mispronounced her name. She watched her aunt speak truth at church board meetings, only to be labeled difficult. She saw women with steel backbones and soft hands get pushed to the edge of every room, only to be remembered as too much when they finally spoke up. So when Jasmine entered Congress, she already knew she wasn't walking into a fair fight, but she also knew she was done playing small to make others feel big. In the studio that morning, Clint's comment wasn't new. It was dressed in different words, but its meaning was ancient. "You're allowed to be here, but only if you shrink to fit." Jasmine didn't shrink. Not on camera, not off it, not ever again. And still, the weight of expectation lingered. Because even when you don't bend to it, you can feel it press against you. When she spoke about housing reform for veterans, the subtext wasn't about policy. It was about decency. Yet she knew that no matter how logical, how data-driven her argument was, her tone would be judged before her content. She recalled a hearing months earlier where she'd proposed redirecting military surplus toward mental health programs. A male colleague had responded by calling her ambitious, with a smirk that made it sound like an insult. That moment came rushing back now, uninvited, as she sat across from Clint. The way men like him always disguised dismissal as nostalgia. The way they lifted the past like a shield and called it experience. And how, even now, some people would hear her speak and label it a performance, because they couldn't fathom a woman being both composed and furious at the same time. So she didn't apologize. Not for her tone, not for her clarity, and especially not for the discomfort that came when truth hit a room unprepared to hold it. If speaking for the invisible makes me loud, she had said once in a closed-door session, then I'll never whisper again. That sentence wasn't caught on a hot mic. It didn't go viral, but it lived in her. And every time someone tried to fit her into a frame too small for her voice, she remembered, frames don't define people. People redefine the frame. She didn't say it to be profound. She said it because it was the only thing that felt honest. As the final minutes of the segment ticked down and Daniel tried to pivot to generic polling questions, Jasmine spoke once more. Not to Clint, not to the host, but to the audience. Not just the people in the room, but the ones watching from homes, from classrooms, from behind desks where they couldn't raise their voices even if they wanted to. Her voice stayed steady, almost quiet. I pulled up a chair, she said, and I'm not giving it back. The line wasn't designed to go viral, but the silence that followed made it land harder than any scripted declaration. Because it wasn't about one interview or one panel. It was about the hundreds of rooms she'd entered before this one. Rooms where she'd been underestimated, sidelined, talked over, or politely ignored. And it was about the millions of people who would never be invited into those rooms at all unless someone like her cracked the door and held it open without apologizing. The phrase pulling up a chair wasn't new. Women before her had used it. Shirley Chisholm, Dolores Huerta, Barbara Jordan. But Jasmine's version came with a modern twist. She didn't just bring a chair, she brought receipts, memory, and the refusal to flinch when the spotlight got hot. And most importantly, she brought the belief that one chair isn't enough, that presence without power is decoration, that being in the room means nothing if you can't shift its temperature. After the show aired, someone on Twitter shared a photo of a folding chair taped to a wall above their daughter's study desk. Underneath, they'd written in marker, "Don't wait to be asked." Another posted a graphic with Jasmine's quote, "I pulled up a chair," but beneath it they added their own, "And I made space for others." The moment had become more than about her. It became a message, a signal, a quiet battle cry. Clint had wanted to debate legacy, but Jasmine had exposed its limits. Legacy doesn't mean gatekeeping, it means evolution. And in that evolution, leadership must look different, speak differently, sound like people who've never had the luxury of being heard without proving why first. Jasmine didn't ask for validation. She didn't need a nod from the men beside her or the network behind the cameras. Because she wasn't speaking to them, she was speaking past them, to the girls who'd been told to cross their legs and bite their tongues, to the workers who were told advocacy was too political, to the young organizers who'd been told to grow up before they stepped up. Her presence wasn't a request, it was a declaration. And in a world that still acts surprised when women, especially Black women, sit with unflinching posture and speak with undiluted truth, sometimes just staying in the chair, owning it fully is the most revolutionary act of all. The morning after the broadcast, the headlines were predictable. Clint holds his ground. Crockett goes viral. Generations clash on live TV. Legacy outlets tried to frame the segment as a heated debate between two ideologies, but that wasn't what people remembered. It wasn't a clash. It wasn't even a contest. It was a contrast. One that asked a question few people were prepared to answer. Who gets to define dignity, and why have we accepted that definition for so long without asking who wrote it? On a panel later that evening, a cable news host described Jasmine's demeanor as calculated restraint, as if calm confidence was a performance rather than presence. Another pundit remarked, "She made good points, but her delivery felt a little too polished, too rehearsed, almost staged." The irony wasn't lost on those who had watched the full segment, because if Jasmine had raised her voice, she would have been called angry. If she had gone silent, she'd be labeled weak. And because she chose clarity and poise, she was somehow accused of being inauthentic. The truth was, no version of her would have satisfied a system built to critique the existence of her voice in the first place. Jasmine heard the noise but didn't respond. Not because she didn't care, but because she had already said what she needed to say. And this time, she knew the world had heard her, even the parts that pretended not to. She had touched something more permanent than attention. She had cracked open a conversation that wouldn't fit neatly back into headlines or sound bites. Because dignity, the way Clint described it, was rooted in stoicism, in swallowing pain, in staying composed while being ignored. But for Jasmine, dignity was something different. It was truth without apology, strength without spectacle. It was refusing to perform for people who had already made up their minds. That difference unsettled many. It forced them to examine the stories they'd inherited about leadership, about control, about who gets to be right without having to yell for it. Jasmine didn't fit the template, and that made her powerful, but also threatening. Not in the way people fear chaos, but in the way they fear mirrors. Because her composure didn't just challenge Clint, it challenged every unspoken rule that had kept so many others outside the room she now occupied. She wasn't there to reclaim dignity. She was there to redefine it, to show that dignity isn't found in silence, but in stillness. Not in backing down, but in standing up without needing to raise your fists. Not in being liked, but in being real. And most of all, in not waiting to be told you're enough before acting like it. And in doing so, she didn't just hold her ground. She changed the shape of it. The clip didn't just live online, it made its way into spaces no algorithm could predict. In a high school history class in Des Moines, a teacher wheeled out a projector cart and paused mid-lesson to show her students the moment Jasmine Crockett looked into the camera and said, "Maybe I'm not too much. Maybe you've been too little for too long." The classroom went silent, not because they didn't understand it, but because they did. In that sentence, students who had been labeled loud, difficult, or disruptive suddenly saw themselves reframed as something else entirely, right-sized all along. Elsewhere, in a corporate boardroom in Atlanta, an HR director played the same clip during a leadership seminar titled Rewriting Authority. She didn't explain it at first, just pressed play. And when it ended, she turned to a group of senior managers and asked, "How many voices in this room have you only listened to after they got small enough to not scare you?" No one spoke for a long time, because Jasmine's sentence wasn't about politics anymore. It was about culture, about thresholds, about how much people had been trained to shrink just to stay employed, included or safe. And then there were the break rooms. In a hospital in St. Paul, a group of night shift nurses huddled around a cracked iPad, rewinding the video for the third time. One of them, a Filipino woman in her 50s, wiped her eyes and said, "I've been waiting 30 years for someone to say that out loud on TV." In a diner in Alabama, a waitress on her lunch break showed the clip to the dishwasher, who just nodded slowly and whispered. She didn't even raise her voice. That's what made it hit harder. These weren't moments for headlines. They weren't trending topics, but they were shifts, small, necessary ones, in rooms that rarely got national airtime. Jasmine had unknowingly become a case study in every place that had long confused silence with civility. Debate coaches replayed her stillness, asking students to analyze not what she said, but how she said it. Church youth groups discussed her as a model of speaking with conviction without losing grace. And in countless staff meetings, she became the proof point for a truth many had known, but never seen affirmed. That sometimes you don't need to raise your volume to raise the bar. For people used to being talked over, Jasmine wasn't just a voice. They were her echo. She wasn't standing on a stage anymore. She was standing inside classrooms, boardrooms, and break rooms across the country, simply because she'd chosen not to sit quiet in someone else's definition of professionalism. That choice, simple as it looked, was radical. Because every time someone like her speaks, without asking first, something old falls away, and something long-awaited begins. A week after the broadcast, the Washington Tribune ran a headline that didn't scream. It reflected. Clint Eastwood brought a legacy. Jasmine Crockett brought a mirror. It wasn't meant as an insult. If anything, it was the most honest description of what had taken place on that soundstage in Dallas. Clint, after all, hadn't come to that interview to belittle anyone. He came carrying everything he had built, decades of work, of respect, of cultural weight. He was the emblem of a kind of America, tough, composed, unyielding. A relic some still revered and others quietly resented. What he didn't expect was that his certainty would meet someone just as grounded, not in history, but in truth. Jasmine didn't come to destroy Clint's legacy. She came to show him what it looked like under new light. And that's what made it so uncomfortable. Because the moment wasn't about disrespect, it was about reflection. And the reflection didn't flatter. It revealed. It asked hard questions. What did your leadership leave behind? Who got to thrive under your version of order? And who had to learn how to survive it? Clint represented a generation that equated silence with control, dominance with respect, and discomfort with progress. But Jasmine came from another lineage, one that valued clarity over calm, questions over compliance, and compassion as strength, not weakness. And when these two definitions of dignity collided on live television, what viewers saw wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. One legacy staring straight into another. One holding the past like a trophy, the other asking, at whose expense? In private, Clint reportedly said he didn't regret the interview. I said what I meant, he told a close friend, and I stand by it. That part didn't surprise anyone. What did surprise people was how many of his longtime fans, men who'd quoted his lines in war movies and westerns, admitted they couldn't shake what Jasmine said. Not because it was loud, but because it lingered. It made them remember the women in their lives who had spoken truthfully and been called difficult. It made them rethink the praise they'd given for quiet suffering, now that they'd seen what dignity could look like when it didn't shrink. And Jasmine? She didn't tour the moment, didn't launch a podcast or write a book. She declined multiple interview requests, not because she wanted to avoid the spotlight, but because the moment wasn't about her. It was about what she'd shown, that sometimes leadership isn't inherited, it's revealed. And sometimes legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you choose to confront before you go. That's what made the mirror more powerful than the name. Because legacy only endures when it adapts, and power only earns respect when it can survive being questioned. Jasmine didn't tear down a monument that day. She simply stood in front of it, held up the truth, and asked the world if they still saw themselves in it. There are things people forget about televised moments. The backdrop, the order of the questions, even who spoke first. But what girls will remember about that morning isn't the politics or the debate, it's the stillness. The way Jasmine Crockett sat unmoved while decades of assumptions tried to wrap themselves around her. The way she looked directly into the lens, not for applause, not for validation, but for someone on the other side of the screen who needed to know they weren't alone. It wasn't about power, it was about proof. Somewhere, a girl in Detroit saw her and realized that assertiveness wasn't arrogance. In Baton Rouge, another girl stopped deleting the word "actually" from her classroom essays. In Oakland, a high school student played the clip for her little sister and said, "Watch this. Just watch." And they did, over and over, because Jasmine didn't break the mold. She ignored it. She didn't repackage softness for easier consumption. She redefined strength without losing an inch of grace. What girls will remember is that Jasmine never asked for the mic. She took it. That she never laughed to soften the edge of her truth. That she said things most women are taught to keep inside their heads for fear of sounding too much. That she looked into the camera and said, "There are girls watching this at home who've been told to quiet down in every classroom they've ever sat in. Women who've been told their ambition was too loud. If one of them sees this and realizes she's not crazy for standing up for herself, then this conversation was worth it." It wasn't a soundbite, it was a seed, planted not in the minds of her critics, but in the hearts of those who had never seen someone like them hold that kind of space and not flinch. It wasn't polished for perfection. It was powerful because it was rooted in lived truth. Jasmine didn't offer a masterclass. She offered a mirror. And what reflected back was permission. To speak without apology, to sit without shrinking, to lead without asking first. And maybe years from now, those girls won't remember her name, but they'll remember what her voice made possible. Leadership for too long had been dressed in a very particular uniform, measured in volume, forged in conflict, and rewarded by how well one could dominate a room. For decades, that image went mostly unquestioned. The loudest voice at the table, the sharpest elbows in a meeting, the man who could stare someone down without blinking. But when Jasmine Crockett walked into that studio, she rewrote that image without saying she was doing it. She didn't come to impose, she came to reveal. And in revealing, she led, not by force, but by presence. She didn't lecture. She didn't plead. She didn't recite talking points until the room surrendered. She simply spoke truth that was too honest to ignore. In doing so, she modeled something quieter and far more difficult. Leadership rooted in conviction, not performance. She embodied the idea that real leaders aren't the ones who need to win the room. They're the ones who don't need the room's permission to be real. That kind of leadership doesn't trend easily. It doesn't always get applause, but it stays. And it stays because it comes from someone who isn't pretending. Jasmine's moment on live television was never about showing strength in the traditional sense. It was about refusing to contort herself into the shape others found most comfortable. About showing that listening is just as much a tool of power as speaking. And that staying calm in the face of dismissal isn't weakness, it's strategy. That's what unsettled so many people watching. She didn't just defy expectations. She dismantled the very structure of those expectations with poise so sharp it left no room for mockery. When the cameras shut off, Jasmine didn't declare victory. She didn't need to, because leadership isn't measured by how well you perform in the moment. It's measured by what lingers after you leave. And what lingered wasn't just her words. It was the silence she left behind. A silence that made people sit differently, think differently, ask themselves, why did that feel like the first time I saw leadership look like me? That's what leadership really means. Not dominance, not bravado, not the ability to drown others out, but the courage to stay fully yourself, even when the room is built to unmake you. And the wisdom to know that the right kind of leadership doesn't demand a spotlight. It becomes one. What Jasmine taught us goes beyond politics. It's a reminder that presence is power, and truth, when spoken calmly and unapologetically, can shift the world more than any shout ever could. In a time when so many are told to wait their turn, to lower their tone, to not make it a thing, she made it a thing and made space for others in the process. So here's the question. What truth have you been carrying that deserves to be heard, not louder but clearer? Because maybe the world isn't waiting for someone louder. Maybe it's waiting for someone real.